At 04:26 hours local time, a small quadcopter closed the last few feet of its flight and struck the side of a rail car that was standing perfectly still. 9 miles ahead of that car stood the Kerch rail bridge, the final crossing into Crimea, and the last obstacle between 2,000 tons of Russian supplies and the units waiting to receive them. 21 cars, 1,200 tons of artillery ammunition, 800 tons of fuel. Within 90 seconds, a column of fire more than 160 feet high would be burning above those tracks, visible from 12 miles away in the dark. And the train had not been caught moving. It had been caught because Russian procedure required it to stop. The Moscow-Simferopol line is not one supply route among many. For Russian forces on the Crimean Peninsula and across the southern front, it is the artery. Rail moves the overwhelming majority of Russian military freight, shells, fuel, armor, spare parts, because nothing else moves that weight at that scale. A single 21-car formation of this type carries somewhere between $45 and $60 million of cargo, and it replaces dozens of truck convoys that would otherwise have to run the same gauntlet in the open. Taman sits on the Russian mainland side of that route, on the peninsula that reaches out toward Crimea. It is the last stretch of Russian home ground before the bridge. Everything bound for the peninsula funnels through it. For the crews running those trains, Taman had come to mean something simple. Get past Taman, and you are across. Russia had already learned what happens to a predictable train. After a string of Ukrainian drone strikes on rail traffic through the south, drivers were instructed to run irregularly. Accelerate, ease off, brake, accelerate again, with no rhythm an observer could lock onto. It works. A drone diving at a moving target has to solve for where a specific car will be several seconds from now, and a small change in speed shifts the impact point by dozens of feet. Randomness was cheap, and it was effective, but there was one thing the drivers were not permitted to randomize. Every military train approaching the crossing had to pass an anti-sabotage security inspection. That meant slowing to a crawl, then stopping completely for roughly 60 seconds. The same point on the map, the same procedure, every single time. You can take any road you like to the airport. You still have to stand still at the scanner. That was the entire operation. Not a hunt, not a chase, a wait. For 48 hours before the strike, Ukrainian reconnaissance watched traffic on that stretch of line, and the only question they needed answered was where the train stopped and for how long. Inside the locomotive cab, the crew was counting down the last easy miles of a hard journey. Somewhere off the tracks, someone else was counting the same miles for the opposite reason. The measure Russia built to protect the train was the measure that pinned it in place. Ukraine knew exactly where that train would come to rest. The problem was that at those coordinates, no short-range attack drone in the inventory could reach it, not unless it started somewhere other than Ukraine. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is where this operation stops making sense. The nearest Ukrainian-held ground lies more than 150 miles from that stretch of track. A standard first-person view attack drone works at 6 to 15 miles. The longest publicly reported FPV strike of the war covered roughly 68 miles, and that flight was treated as a record precisely because nothing else had come close. There is no version of the math where a quadcopter takes off from Ukrainian lines and arrives over the Taman crossing with enough battery to hunt. So it didn't. The drones that hit that train were launched from within a few miles of the rails by a small team that was already there. How a team like that gets into position and how the airframes get to them is not something open sources document, and this account does not pretend to know. What matters tactically is the consequence. Once the launch point moves next to the target, every advantage the defense had built around distance stops functioning. Long-range air defense is oriented outward, toward the approach corridors, toward the threat that comes from the west at altitude. A drone that begins its flight 3 miles away and never climbs above the tree line does not approach from anywhere. It is simply, suddenly, present. Above the line, one aircraft was already up, an Autel EVO II Dual 640T, a commercial reconnaissance quadcopter. the kind sold openly, carrying two sensors at once, a thermal imager and a high-resolution optical camera. It was not there to attack anything. It was there to be the eye that the strike drones did not have. On paper, it is unremarkable. Something in the range of 38 minutes of endurance. A service ceiling around 15,000 feet. A control and video link good for roughly 9 miles in clean conditions. Nothing in that list is a weapon. But thermal imaging does not care what a machine costs. Against the cold ground of a winter night, a diesel locomotive that has been under load for hours is not hiding. Neither are fuel cars, which hold their heat long after the air around them has given it up. Walk through a parking lot at 3 in the morning and every vehicle looks the same, except the one that came in an hour ago, which glows like the end of a cigarette to anything that reads heat. The train did not have to be found. It announced itself car by car, and the thermal frame separated the loaded tankers from the empty flats without anyone needing a single photon of visible light. And the airframe carrying that sensor sat inside a gap in the defense that is not an oversight so much as a compromise. Surveillance radar sorts contacts by speed and by return size, and it discards the low, slow, and small, because if it did not, every bird along the coast would generate an alert, and the operators would stop believing their own screens. A commercial quadcopter hovering under 50 miles an hour is filed under noise. It was watched by nobody, and it watched everything. The data was clean. The approach was set. 3 miles from the rails, a system mounted on a truck chassis came up on power. The R-330Zh Zhitel is a mobile electronic warfare complex. Its job is to suppress radio communications and satellite navigation signals across an area, and it is exactly the sort of asset that would be positioned to cover a crossing of this value. It sweeps across multiple frequency bands, identifies the ones actually carrying traffic, and then concentrates its output into them, with particular attention to 1.2 and 5.8 GHz, the two bands that carry video and control for most commercial-derived drones in this war. Against a drone still being flown by a human on a live video feed, that is close to a kill. Cut the picture and the aircraft is finished, but drowning out a phone call only works while the other person still has the handset against their ear. In the last stretch of an attack run, an FPV is not listening. It is flying on the accelerometers and gyroscopes inside its own body, holding the line it was pointed down, correcting against what the forward camera can see below it. Tree lines, poles, the rails themselves. Jamming the link at that point removes the operator. It does not remove the drone. Timing compounded it. A system like that has to detect an anomalous emitter, localize it, identify which band it is using, and then commit power to that band, and each of those steps costs seconds. The drone moving at 90 miles an hour covers 130 feet every second it is given. And the window that mattered, the 60 seconds the train would spend at a standstill, was not going to wait for anyone to finish the sequence. At 04:26 hours and 20 seconds, the first drone went in. It struck a car near the rear of the formation, and it detonated exactly as designed. Through the outer steel, into the compartment, warhead functioning inside. And nothing happened. No secondary, no chain. The car was carrying crated equipment, packed tight and braced with steel, and braced cargo absorbs a blast rather than transmitting it. The explosion stayed where it was made. Steel came off the sides of the car and landed on the ballast, and 20 of the 21 cars were untouched. In the cab, the driver felt it and did the correct thing. Throttle forward. Get out of the inspection zone. 21 loaded cars leaned into the pull, and the formation began to move. By any reasonable reading, the ambush had just failed. The train was rolling, the surprise was spent, and the 60-second window had closed. Except that the train was not accelerating, and the reason it could not was sitting on the rails behind it, put there by the strike that had just gone wrong. The warhead had not detonated the car, but it had deformed it. A section of the underframe was folded downward, hanging near the wheel assembly, and as the wheels turned, it dragged along the railhead. Every increment of throttle bought a little more speed and a little more friction, and the friction won. Sparks came off the trailing end in long streams. The locomotive was roaring and the formation was crawling. The failed strike had become the anchor. 7 drones went to pursuit. They dropped to 15 feet, ran along both sides of the roadbed at 100 miles an hour, and closed on a target that could no longer outrun anything. Above them, the thermal camera swept the full 21 cars, sorting the wrecked from the loaded. And 2 priorities came back: the 5th car from the locomotive, and 1 further back in the formation. The 5th car was a fuel tanker. 2 drones came at it from different angles. The first went into the center of the tank body. The second came in lower at the valve assembly, where the plating is thinner and the lines run close together. Both warheads functioned within the same heartbeat. Pressure spiked, the tank body tore, and the fuel inside stopped being liquid. It became mist, and mist burns all at once. A fireball roughly 60 feet across opened around the car and a wall of flame went up above the tracks. The blast wave ran the length of the train and pushed fire into the 2 cars on either side. Heat began working on the tanks next to it. Valves lifted and vapor jetted out in streams dozens of feet long before igniting. Within seconds, 4 cars were burning together in a corridor of fire 300 feet long. The next pair missed. The formation lurched as the dragging steel caught the rail. The target car moved a few feet in the space of a second, and both drones went into the coupling gap and detonated outside the hull. The pair behind them did not miss. They abandoned that car, shifted to an artillery ammunition car directly behind it, and went in one after the other, the first opening the steel, the second driving into the same weakened point less than a second later. That warhead reached the inside. The initial flame was small, barely 20 feet. Then the shells stacked in that compartment started going off against each other, and the car came apart. Steel plating weighing hundreds of pounds went into the air. The roof was thrown more than 40 feet up. A column of fire close to 150 feet high stood over the middle of the formation and joined the fuel fire burning ahead of it. The last 2 went to Car 18, the one section of the train that the fires had not yet reached. They came in at 10 feet through smoke and falling debris, one behind the other, into the same hole. The rear of the train opened up in a fireball 100 feet wide, and smoke and flame climbed past 160 feet. By 0428 hours, the 3 fire zones, front, middle, rear, had linked into one. Less than 90 seconds had passed since the strike that failed. What burned was roughly 2,000 tons of cargo. What did not burn was buried under 21 wrecked cars, and that is the part that matters. Rail warped under sustained heat. Ties charred out. The ballast bed cracked. Unexploded artillery rounds were scattered across the roadbed and the ground on either side of it. Russia could not simply couple a locomotive to the wreck and pull the line clear. Before a single train moved through again, crews had to put the fire out, sweep for live ordnance, lift out the destroyed cars one at a time, and rebuild the track bed underneath. Days of work, in the open, on a stretch of line that had just demonstrated it was reachable. One blocked section is enough. Everything behind it stops, and the shells and fuel and armor stacked in those formations sit still. Moscow can move the load by road, but replacing a single 21-car train means dozens to hundreds of trucks, plus drivers, plus fuel for the drivers, plus escorts, and all of it has to run the Azov corridor, where a convoy is a far easier thing to find than a train. That is the shape of the campaign, not the shape of one night. Ukraine has been cutting the southern rail network steadily. Stations, traction substations, junctions, in what one Ukrainian defense analyst described as death by 1,000 cuts. Small strikes that individually change little and collectively strangle a supply system. The rail bridge on the Kerch-Dzhankoy line has been hit. The last rail-capable ferry at Kerch is gone. Every fallback Crimea had is being closed, one at a time. Ukraine never needed to drop the bridge. It only needed everything that crosses it to stop somewhere first. Which part of this stands out most to you? That a security procedure became the aiming solution? That the drone strike which failed is what kept the train from escaping? Or that short-range drones reached the gateway to Crimea at all? Tell me in the comments. If you want more breakdowns of how these operations actually work, subscribe and turn on notifications.